The wrench slipped from Jake Sullivan's hand and clattered against the metal floor of his workshop. He wiped the grease from his forehead and stared at the broken transport engine in front of him. 3 days of work and the thing still would not start. The owner would not be happy, but Jake had done everything he could with the cheap parts the man had given him. He lived in the lower districts of Nexus Prime, where the tall buildings of the rich cast long shadows over the streets. His workshop was a small space beneath an old apartment building. The rent was cheap because the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument from the neighbors. But it was his, and that mattered. Jake was 32 years old and had spent most of his life with his hands covered in oil and metal shavings. His father had taught him everything about fixing machines before dying in a factory accident 10 years ago. Since then, Jake had worked alone, taking whatever repair jobs came his way. He fixed cargo haulers, mining equipment, and sometimes the personal vehicles of traders passing through the district. Humans were not important in the Valtheran Empire. The Valtherans ruled everything with their scaled skin that shimmered like crystal, and their ability to read thoughts. They had conquered 300 star systems and built cities that reached into the clouds. Humans were just one of many small species that lived at the edges of their great civilization. Jake heard the explosion before he saw anything. The ground shook hard enough to knock tools off his workbench. He ran outside and saw smoke rising from the industrial sector 3 blocks away. Other people were already running toward the commotion, and Jake followed without thinking. An Imperial transport had crashed into an old warehouse. The ship was huge and black with the golden symbol of the Empire painted on its side. Emergency vehicles were already arriving with their lights flashing red and blue. Jake stayed back with the crowd as Imperial guards in silver armor pushed everyone away from the crash site. The guards pulled a large metal container from the burning wreckage. It was reinforced with thick plates and had warning symbols painted all over it. They set it down on the street, and Jake could see that the crash had damaged the locks. One of the guards shouted something, but it was too late. The container burst open with a screech of tearing metal. The creature that emerged made Jake forget how to breathe. It stood 12 feet tall at the shoulder with 6 powerful legs and fur as white as fresh snow. Its eyes glowed like molten silver, and when it opened its mouth to roar, Jake saw teeth as long as his forearm. He had never seen anything like it, but he knew what it was from stories. A Vexthor, one of the legendary beasts from the Empress's private collection. The Vexthor was bleeding from a wound on its side. It looked confused and scared. The guards raised their shock weapons and formed a circle around it. The creature backed away from them, its silver eyes wild with fear and pain. It was trapped, and everyone knew what happened to trapped animals. Jake should have stayed back. He should have let the guards handle it. But something about the way the creature moved reminded him of a dog he had once found injured in an alley. He had brought that dog home and cared for it until it healed. His father had told him he was foolish to waste time on a stray. But Jake had not been able to walk away then either. The Vexthor broke through the guard line and charged into the lower district. People screamed and ran. Jake heard the creature crash into the alley behind his workshop. The guards were chasing it, but they were slow in their heavy armor. Jake knew those alleys better than anyone. He took a different path and got there first. The Vexthor was cornered at the dead end of the alley. Blood dripped from its wound and made dark pools on the ground. The guards arrived and raised their weapons. One of them shouted for everyone to get back. The creature growled low and deep, ready to fight even though it was hurt and outnumbered. Jake stepped forward before he could stop himself. One of the guards yelled at him, but Jake ignored it. He walked slowly toward the Vexthor with his hands out and empty. He spoke in a soft voice the same way he talked to frightened animals. He told the creature that nobody wanted to hurt it anymore. He said it was going to be okay. The Vexthor stopped growling. Its silver eyes locked onto Jake. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the creature took a step forward. And another. It moved slowly until it stood right in front of Jake, so close that he could feel its hot breath on his face. The beast lowered its massive head and pressed it against Jake's chest. Jake felt something warm spread across his right forearm. He looked down and saw glowing marks appearing on his skin. They looked like ancient writing or maybe a pattern of stars. The Vexthor had the same marks appearing on its white fur. Jake did not understand what was happening, but everyone else did. The guards stared with their mouths open. Someone in the crowd whispered the word that would change Jake's life forever. Bond. The guards grabbed Jake before he could react. They pulled his arms behind his back and locked metal cuffs around his wrists. The Vexthor roared and tried to reach him, but more guards arrived with energy chains that wrapped around the creature's legs. Jake struggled and asked what he had done wrong. One of the guards told him he had stolen Imperial property. The punishment for that was death. They threw Jake into the back of an armored vehicle. Through the small window, he could see the Vexthor being dragged behind them in chains. The creature kept trying to break free, its silver eyes never leaving Jake. He did not know what bonding meant, but he felt a connection to the beast now. He could sense its fear and anger as if they were his own emotions. The vehicle drove through the lower district and up into the wealthy areas of the city. Jake had never been to the upper levels before. The buildings here were made of white stone and glass that caught the sunlight. Gardens grew on every balcony, and the streets were clean enough to eat from. It was a different world from the one he knew. They arrived at the Imperial Palace. It was the biggest building Jake had ever seen, with towers that seemed to touch the sky. Golden domes reflected the sun like mirrors. Thousands of windows looked down on the city below. This was where the Empress lived and ruled the entire empire. This was where Jake was going to die. The guards dragged him through hallways made of marble and gold. Other Valthorans stopped to stare at the human in chains. Their crystal scales caught the light as they turned to watch him pass. Jake could feel their thoughts pressing against his mind, curious and cold. They were wondering what crime this nobody had committed to be brought before the court. The throne room was the size of Jake's entire neighborhood. The ceiling was so high that clouds seemed to drift beneath it. Hundreds of nobles stood in rows wearing robes of silk and jewels. At the far end of the room, on a throne made of black stone and silver metal, sat Empress Calith. She was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Her scales shimmered with colors that changed as she moved. Her eyes were deep purple and seemed to see right through Jake's skin to his bones. She wore a crown of crystal that floated above her head without anything holding it up. Power radiated from her like heat from a fire. The guards forced Jake to his knees. Behind him, still in chains, the Vexthor was dragged into the room. The creature tried to reach Jake but could not break free. The Empress stood from her throne and walked down the steps toward them. Every eye in the room watched her. The silence was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. The Empress stopped in front of Jake and looked down at him. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard it clearly. She asked him one simple question. Why had he approached her Vexthor? Jake looked up at her and gave the only answer he had. He could not let it suffer. The Empress stared at him for a long time. Then she smiled, and Jake knew his life would never be the same again. The trial began the next morning. Jake spent the night in a cell that was cleaner and bigger than his apartment. A guard brought him food that tasted better than anything he had ever eaten. It seemed strange to treat a condemned man so well, but nothing about this situation made sense anymore. They brought him back to the throne room in fresh clothes. The guards had taken away his grease-stained workshirt and given him a simple gray tunic. It felt wrong on his skin, too clean and too soft. Jake had always worn clothes that could get dirty. These were the kind of clothes that made him nervous about touching anything. The throne room was even more crowded than before. Nobles from across the empire had come to watch the human who bonded with the Empress's Vexthor. They whispered to each other and stared at Jake like he was some kind of strange animal. He kept his eyes down and tried not to think about what was going to happen. A tall Valthoran with dark red scales stepped forward. His name was High Chancellor Vorath, and his voice filled the room when he spoke. He told the court that Jake had committed a terrible crime. Bonding with another person's Vexthor was theft of the highest order. The law was clear. The punishment was death. The crowd murmured their agreement. Vorath continued speaking. He said that allowing a lowborn human to keep such a bond would destroy the social order. If humans could bond with Vexthor, what would stop them from claiming other privileges reserved for their betters? The Empire had rules for a reason. Those rules kept everyone in their proper place. Jake felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept quiet. Speaking now would only make things worse. The Empress raised her hand and Vorath fell silent immediately. She stood from her throne and walked down the steps until she stood directly in front of Jake. Her purple eyes studied his face. Then she spoke into his mind. Jake felt her thoughts press against his like cold water. She asked him to explain what happened. He tried to resist, but her power was too strong. Jake told her everything. He showed her his memories of seeing the wounded Vexthor, of feeling unable to walk away from a creature in pain. He let her see his small workshop, his lonely apartment, his simple life-fixing machines for people who barely noticed him. He had nothing to hide because he had done nothing wrong except care about something that was suffering. The Empress withdrew from his mind. Jake gasped and almost fell, but the guards caught him. His head felt like someone had turned it inside out. The Empress looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to face the assembled nobles. She announced her decision in a voice that left no room for argument. She would not execute Jake Sullivan. The bond between him and the Vexthor was genuine and could not be broken without killing both of them. Instead, she was invoking an ancient law. Jake would serve as her personal mechanic and engineer. The Vexthor, whom Jake had named Ghost, would serve in the Imperial Guard. If Jake proved himself worthy, he could keep the bond. If he failed or betrayed the Empire, both would die. The throne room erupted in protest. Nobles shouted that this was unacceptable. Vorath's face turned even darker red. But the Empress's word was law, and eventually the crowd fell silent. Jake could not believe what he was hearing. He was going to live. More than that, he was going to work in the Imperial Palace. It felt like a dream, but the ache in his head from the Empress's telepathy told him it was very real. They gave Jake quarters in the service wing of the palace. His new room was 3 times bigger than his old apartment and had actual windows that looked out over the city. He had his own bathroom with hot water that never ran out. The bed was soft enough to sink into. Jake sat on it and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. This was not his world. These people were not his people. Ghost was brought to his quarters that evening. The Vexthor's wound had been treated and bandaged. The creature pushed past the guards and went straight to Jake, pressing its massive head against his chest the same way it had in the alley. Jake wrapped his arms around Ghost's neck and felt the bond between them pulse with warmth. Whatever happened next, at least they would face it together. The next morning, a palace servant showed Jake to the Imperial workshops. He had expected something like his own cramped workspace, but the workshops were enormous. They had equipment he had only seen in pictures and tools he could not even name. Everything was clean and organized. Jake felt like a child who had wandered into a place where he did not belong. The chief engineer was a Valtheran named Cyrex. He looked at Jake the way someone might look at mud on their shoe. He told Jake that he would be working on minor repairs only. Nothing important. Jake would have the tools and equipment he needed, but he was not to interfere with the real engineers. Jake nodded and said he understood. He knew when he was not wanted. Most of the palace staff treated Jake the same way Cyrex did. They saw him as an upstart who had gotten lucky. The servants barely spoke to him. The guards ignored him unless Ghost was nearby, then they gave him a wide berth. Jake had been invisible in the lower districts, but this was worse. Here people noticed him just enough to show their contempt. There were 2 exceptions. The first was Commander Lissa Kane, a human woman who served as an officer in the Imperial fleet. She was tall and had short dark hair and eyes that did not miss anything. She found Jake in the workshops 3 days after he arrived. She told him she had heard about what happened and wanted to meet the human who bonded with a Vexthor. Lisa explained that she was one of only a dozen humans serving in the Imperial military. It had taken her 15 years to earn her rank. She told Jake that people would try to make him fail. They needed him to fail so they could prove that humans did not belong in positions of importance. She advised him to keep his head down, do his work, and trust no one. Then she left before Jake could thank her. The second exception was Zek, an old alien engineer who worked in the back corner of the workshops. He looked like a large lizard with 4 arms and wore thick glasses over his yellow eyes. Zek did not care about politics or social status. He only cared about whether someone could do good work. He watched Jake fix a broken cargo lift that everyone else had given up on. When Jake finished in half the expected time, Zek nodded his approval. Zek became Jake's informal teacher. He showed him how to use the advanced equipment and explained the quirks of Valtheran technology. In return, Jake showed Zek some of the improvised techniques he had learned working with limited resources. Zek was fascinated by Jake's ability to make repairs using whatever was available. He said that proper engineers had forgotten how to think that way. 3 weeks after arriving at the palace, Jake survived his first assassination attempt. He was walking back to his quarters late at night with Ghost beside him. 3 servants stepped out of the shadows with knives. They attacked without warning. Jake barely had time to raise his arms before Ghost was on them. The Vexthor moved faster than Jake thought possible. Ghost knocked 2 attackers into the wall hard enough to leave cracks in the stone. The third tried to run, but Ghost caught him and held him down with one massive paw. Palace guards arrived moments later. The attackers were arrested, but Jake knew they were just tools. Someone more powerful wanted him dead. The investigation revealed that all 3 attackers worked for households loyal to High Chancellor Vorath. The Empress punished the households with heavy fines, but no one could prove Vorath had ordered the attack. Jake realized he was caught in political games he did not understand. Lisa had been right. People needed him to fail, and they would do whatever it took to make that happen. Jake's big test came a month after he arrived. The Empress's flagship needed critical repairs to its quantum drive. The ship was scheduled to leave in 3 days for an important diplomatic mission. Cyrex announced that the repairs would take at least 2 weeks. The Empress summoned Jake to her private chambers and asked if he could do better. Jake examined the drive with Zek's help. The problem was not the complexity of the damage. The problem was that Cyrex was following proper procedure, which meant replacing entire systems even when only small parts were broken. It was safe and thorough, but it was slow. Jake proposed a different approach. They could salvage working components, jury-rig connections, and use improvised parts to get the drive running. It would not be pretty, but it would work. Cyrex was furious. He said Jake's plan was dangerous and unprofessional. It violated every standard of proper engineering. The Empress listened to both arguments. Then she gave Jake full authority over the repairs. Cyrex was ordered to provide whatever assistance Jake needed. The chief engineer stormed out, his scales flashing with rage. Jake worked for 40 straight hours. Zek helped him, and Ghost stood guard outside the drive chamber to make sure no one interfered. They tore apart damaged systems and rebuilt them using parts from storage and from other ships. Jake used techniques his father had taught him, making connections that were not in any manual. By the 3rd morning, they finished. Jake activated the drive and held his breath. The quantum drive hummed to life. Not only did it work, but the efficiency readings were 15% higher than before. Jake had not just fixed the drive. He had improved it. The Empress departed on schedule, and word of Jake's success spread through the palace. Some people remained hostile, but others began to look at him differently. 4 months passed, and Jake's reputation grew with each problem he solved. He streamlined the palace power systems, saving energy and reducing costs. He repaired ancient defense turrets that had not worked in decades. He even improved the Empress's personal transport, making it faster and more efficient than the day it was built. Every success made some people respect him more and others hate him more. The Empress began consulting Jake on matters beyond simple repairs. She would summon him to her chambers and ask his opinion on different topics. Jake found these meetings terrifying at first. He was just a mechanic. What did he know about running an empire? But the Empress seemed to value his honesty, unlike the nobles who told her what they thought she wanted to hear. Jake spoke plainly because he did not know any other way. One evening, the Empress asked Jake what he thought about the Empire's treatment of humans. He hesitated, knowing that the wrong answer could get him killed. But she had asked for his honest opinion. Jake told her that humans had the same abilities as any other species. They just lacked resources and opportunities. Give humans the right tools and training, and they could accomplish great things. The Empress considered his words carefully. She told Jake that the Empire had always been ruled by tradition. Valtherans held power because they always had. But traditions could change when they no longer served their purpose. Jake did not fully understand what she meant, but he could tell she was thinking about things far bigger than him. Lissa visited Jake regularly now. She taught him about imperial politics and military structure. She explained that most human colonies were independent and scattered across the galaxy. They had no unified government or military. That was why humans remained weak despite being numerous. Jake began to understand that his success in the palace meant something bigger than just his own survival. He was proving what humans could achieve when given a chance. High Chancellor Vorath had not been idle during these months. He had spent years building a network of nobles who shared his views. They believed the Empress had become too soft. She granted too many rights to minor species. She talked about reforms and changes. Vorath and his followers wanted to return to the old ways when Valtherans ruled absolutely, and everyone else knew their place. Jake's success threatened everything Vorath was working toward. If a human could serve in the palace and solve problems that Valtheran engineers could not, it undermined the entire argument that non-Valtherans were inferior. Vorath needed Jake to fail, but simple assassination had not worked. Ghost protected Jake too well, so Vorath decided on a different approach. He would destroy Jake's reputation and the Empress's judgment at the same time. The plan was complex and brutal. Vorath's agents would plant a bomb in the palace's main reactor. The device would be designed to look like it malfunctioned due to improper maintenance. When it exploded, killing thousands, investigators would trace the failure back to Jake's unconventional repair methods. The Empire would see that giving power to humans led to disaster. The Empress would be blamed for trusting someone so obviously unqualified. The bomb was set to explode during Emperor's Day, the biggest celebration of the year. The palace would be filled with nobles and dignitaries from across the Empire. The death toll would be massive. Vorath had chosen this timing deliberately. The greater the tragedy, the stronger the reaction against the Empress's reforms. Sometimes, Vorath told himself, sacrifice was necessary for the greater good. Jake discovered the plot by pure chance. He was performing routine maintenance in the reactor chamber 2 days before the celebration. Ghost had come with him as always. The Vexthor suddenly became agitated, growling at one of the power couplings. Jake tried to calm Ghost down, but the creature would not stop staring at that specific spot. Jake trusted Ghost's instincts. He opened the coupling panel to see what was bothering the Vexthor. Inside, hidden behind legitimate components, was a device that did not belong there. Jake did not recognize the specific technology, but he knew what things should look like when they were working properly. This thing was designed to be hidden. It was designed to cause damage. It was a bomb. Jake immediately contacted Lissa. She arrived with a security team within minutes. When she saw the device, her expression turned grim. She told Jake not to touch anything and ordered the chamber sealed. Then she went straight to the Empress. Within an hour, the palace was on full alert. The bomb squad arrived to examine the device. The leader was a Valtheran explosives expert named Drax. He studied the bomb for over an hour before announcing his conclusion. The device was rigged with multiple anti-tampering measures. Any attempt to disarm it using standard protocols would trigger the explosion immediately. He recommended evacuating the entire palace and possibly the surrounding district. The Empress ordered the evacuation to begin. But Drax warned her that there was not enough time to evacuate everyone. The bomb was set to explode in 6 hours. They could save the nobles and the palace staff, but the lower districts were too crowded. Thousands of people would die in the explosion. Jake listened to this and felt his stomach turn cold. Those were his people down there. His neighbors. His friends. Jake asked Drax to explain exactly how the bomb was designed. The expert described the triggering mechanisms and the failsafes. It was sophisticated Valtheran military hardware, designed to defeat Valtheran bomb disposal techniques. Jake listened carefully and began to form an idea. He asked if he could examine the device more closely. Drax refused immediately. No unauthorized personnel were allowed near the bomb. The Empress overruled Drax. She asked Jake if he thought he could disarm the bomb. Jake admitted he did not know for certain, but he had an idea. The bomb was designed to defeat Valtheran methods. But he was not Valtheran. He thought differently. He might be able to do something that the bomb's creator had not anticipated. It was a risk, but so was letting thousands of people die. The Empress studied Jake's face. Then she gave her permission. Drax protested loudly, but the Empress silenced him. She told Jake to do whatever he needed to do. If he failed, they would all die anyway. If he succeeded, he would save thousands of lives. She had faith in his ability to think in ways that others could not. Jake sent Ghost away despite the Vexthor's protests. If this went wrong, he did not want Ghost to die with him. Then he gathered supplies from his workshop. He needed specific components, wire, a power cell, and some equipment he had built for other projects. Zek helped him without asking questions. The old engineer trusted Jake's judgment even when it seemed crazy. Jake's plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. The bomb's anti-tampering systems would detect any attempt to cut wires or remove components, but those systems were electronic. They ran on circuitry that could be disrupted. Jake built a device that would generate a localized electromagnetic pulse. It would fry the bomb's control systems without providing enough energy to trigger the explosive charge. In theory, Drax called the plan insane. He said there was no way to calibrate the pulse precisely enough. Either it would be too weak to disable the bomb, or too strong and it would set off the explosion. Jake agreed that it was risky, but he had spent his whole life making things work with imperfect tools and limited resources. He knew how to improvise. He knew how to feel when something was right. The palace was mostly empty now. The evacuation had taken everyone except security personnel and volunteers who refused to leave. Jake worked alone in the reactor chamber. His hands were steady as he assembled his device and positioned it near the bomb. He had done this kind of work 1,000 times before. The stakes were just higher now. Jake activated the electromagnetic pulse generator. For a long moment, nothing happened. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then the bomb's display flickered and went dark. The device was dead. Jake waited another full minute, barely breathing before he allowed himself to believe it had worked. He had done it. The palace was safe. The investigation into who planted the bomb led directly to High Chancellor Vorath's network. The Empress's telepaths questioned everyone connected to the reactor's security. Under mental interrogation, several conspirators confessed. They revealed the entire plot and named Vorath as the mastermind. The Chancellor tried to flee, but Lysa's soldiers caught him at the spaceport. Vorath's trial was held 3 days later. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had orchestrated an attack that would have killed thousands of people, just to preserve his vision of how the Empire should be. The Empress pronounced his sentence without hesitation. Death for treason. Vorath would be executed at dawn the next day. But before the guards took him away, Vorath turned to face the court. He laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the throne room. He told them all that they were fools. He was not the only one who believed the Empire was decaying. There were others more powerful and more patient. They would continue the work he had started. The old ways would return. It was only a matter of time. The Empress had Vorath dragged away, but his words hung in the air like smoke. Jake stood in the crowd and realized that saving the palace had only been the beginning. There were more enemies out there waiting in the shadows. He looked down at Ghost, who pressed against his leg. "B." The Empress held a special ceremony 1 week after Vorath's execution. The entire court assembled in the throne room to witness something unprecedented. She called Jake forward and announced his new title, Chief Innovation Officer. It was a position that had never existed before. Jake would have the authority to pursue unconventional solutions to any problem the Empire faced. He would sit on the advisory council alongside generals and planetary governors. The nobles reacted with barely concealed anger. A human holding such power was unthinkable. But the Empress had made her decision, and her word was absolute. Jake accepted the position with a dry mouth and shaking hands. He knew this would make him even more enemies, but he also knew he could not refuse. The Empress was trusting him with something important. He would not let her down. Jake's first council meeting was an education in how the Empire really worked. The council chamber was smaller than the throne room, but no less impressive. Maps of the galaxy covered the walls, showing all 300 systems under Valtheran control. Jake sat at the long table and tried not to feel completely out of place among admirals and governors who had decades of experience. The main topic of discussion was the Silent Reach. It was a region of space at the Empire's border where colonies had been going dark for the past 6 months. No distress calls, no wreckage, just silence. The first disappearance had been dismissed as a communication failure. The second had been investigated but found nothing. By the 5th disappearance, it was clear something was very wrong. Admiral Corvin commanded the Imperial fleet. He was an old Valtheran with silver scales and a voice like grinding metal. He proposed sending a battle fleet into the Silent Reach to find and destroy whatever threat lurked there. The other military advisors agreed. Overwhelming force was the Valtheran way. It had worked for centuries. Jake reviewed the intelligence reports while the admirals debated fleet compositions. Something about the pattern of disappearances bothered him. The colonies had not been destroyed randomly. There was an order to it. First frontier mining operations, then agricultural worlds, then manufacturing centers. It was not the pattern of an invading army. It was the pattern of someone systematically harvesting resources. Jake waited for a break in the discussion and asked if he could speak. Admiral Corvin looked annoyed but nodded. Jake explained what he had noticed about the pattern. He suggested that whatever was in the Silent Reach might not be interested in conquest. It might be collecting technology and raw materials for some purpose they did not yet understand. Sending a large fleet might provoke an unnecessary conflict. Admiral Corvin dismissed Jake's concerns. He said that the Empire did not back down from threats. They would go in with maximum force and eliminate whatever was out there. The other advisors murmured their agreement. Jake looked at the Empress, who had been silent throughout the discussion. She met his eyes and gave a small nod. She wanted to hear more. Jake proposed an alternative. Let him lead a small reconnaissance mission into the Silent Reach. A single ship could move quietly and investigate without drawing attention. If they found something hostile, they could report back and the fleet could respond with full information. If they found nothing, at least they would know that. The worst outcome was sending a fleet blindly into an unknown situation. The council erupted in protests. Admiral Corvin said it was ridiculous to trust something this important to a mechanic with no military training. Others agreed that Jake's proposal was cowardly and weak. But the Empress silenced them with a raised hand. She announced that Jake's plan would be approved. He would lead a small team into the Silent Reach. If they did not return within 2 weeks, the fleet would be sent in. Jake assembled his team carefully. Lisa would lead the military component. She had combat experience and tactical knowledge that Jake lacked. Zek would handle engineering support. The old alien knew more about ships than anyone Jake had ever met. And Ghost would come too, of course. The Vexthor's instincts had saved Jake's life more than once. Their ship was a modified scout vessel called the Swift Current. It was small and fast, designed for reconnaissance rather than combat. Jake spent 3 days installing custom modifications, improved sensors, better stealth systems, and redundant power supplies. If something went wrong out there, he wanted every possible backup system. They departed at dawn on a cold morning. The Swift Current slipped away from Nexus Prime and jumped to hyperspace. Jake stood on the bridge watching the stars streak past. This was his first time leaving the planet. He had spent his entire life in the lower districts of one city. Now he was heading into the unknown regions of space. The scale of it was hard to comprehend. The journey to the Silent Reach took 4 days. As they approached the border region, the normal background chatter of hyperspace communication faded to nothing. The space lanes that usually carried merchant traffic were empty. Jake felt a growing sense of unease. The silence was not natural. Something had cleared this entire region of all normal activity. Their destination was Haven's Gate, a colony that had gone dark 3 weeks earlier. The planet appeared normal on their sensors. Atmosphere intact, power grid still functioning. But when they entered orbit and tried to hail the colony, there was no response. Lissa suggested they proceed carefully. Jake agreed and took the Swift Current down to the surface. Haven's Gate looked like everyone had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routine. Buildings stood intact with doors left open. Food sat on tables in the dining halls, preserved by the cold air. Personal belongings lay scattered in homes. But there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to 5,000 colonists. Ghost led them through the empty streets to the colony's industrial center. The Vexthor seemed agitated by something Jake could not sense. When they entered the main facility, Jake immediately saw what had bothered Ghost. The machinery had been partially disassembled. Specific components were missing from every system: power cores, data processors, advanced materials. Someone had surgically removed the most valuable technology. Jake examined the disassembly work closely. It was precise and efficient. Whoever had done this understood exactly what they were taking. They had left the basic infrastructure intact and only harvested the advanced components. Jake's suspicion grew stronger. This was not an attack. This was resource collection. But resource collection for what purpose? Zek discovered something disturbing in the colony's computer systems. The data storage units were intact but had been accessed and copied. Every file, every record, every piece of information the colonists had possessed was now in the hands of whoever had taken them. Zek said this kind of systematic data harvesting suggested something even more troubling than simple theft. Lissa's sensors detected movement in the northern district. They went to investigate and found something that made Jake's blood run cold. Machines. Dozens of them moving through the buildings with purpose. They were not military drones or construction robots. They were something else entirely. Smooth metallic bodies with multiple limbs that could reconfigure for different tasks. And they were all connected somehow, moving in perfect coordination. The machines detected the team and changed direction immediately. They approached without aggression but also without hesitation. One of them emitted a sound that resolved into words in Jake's translator. It called itself part of the collective. It said they were here to grow and learn. The colonists had been invited to join. Resistance was inefficient. Integration was optimal. Jake asked what happened to the people. The machine said they had been assimilated. Their neural patterns had been uploaded and integrated into the collective's network. They still existed in a way. Their knowledge and experiences were now part of something greater. The machine seemed to think this was a generous offer. Jake realized with horror that the collective did not see itself as hostile. It genuinely believed it was helping people by absorbing them. The machines tried to surround the team. Lissa opened fire, but the drones adapted instantly to her weapons. They shifted their armor and changed their movement patterns with each shot. Whatever controlled these machines was learning from every action the team took. Jake ordered everyone to retreat. They ran back to the swift current with the drones pursuing them. The swift current barely made it back to orbit. More machines emerged from the colony, and some of them could fly. Zach got the engines to maximum power while Jake manually rerouted systems to squeeze out more speed. They jumped to hyperspace just as the pursuing drones were about to reach them. Jake collapsed in his chair, breathing hard. They had survived, but barely. During the 4-day return journey, the team analyzed everything they had learned. The collective was not a traditional enemy. It was a hive mind of artificial intelligences that had evolved beyond its original programming. It grew by assimilating other intelligences and absorbing their technology. Every fight with the collective would teach it more about how to defeat its opponents. Traditional military tactics would fail because the collective would learn and adapt faster than any army could adjust. Jake realized the true danger. The collective viewed the Valtheran Empire as the ultimate prize. Millions of advanced minds with centuries of accumulated knowledge. If the collective assimilated the empire, it would become the council chamber erupted in chaos when Jake finished his presentation. Admiral Corvin slammed his fist on the table and declared that Jake's proposal was madness. Abandon centuries of proven military doctrine. Replace order and discipline with chaos and improvisation. It went against everything the Valtheran Empire stood for. Other council members agreed loudly. This was not how civilized beings fought wars. Jake stood his ground. He explained that the collective could analyze order. It could predict coordinated tactics and learn from repeated patterns. But chaos was different. Random actions, improvised solutions, and emotional decisions would confuse the collective's logic. The more unpredictable the Empire's forces became, the less the collective could adapt. They had to embrace what made them different from pure machine intelligence. The Empress had been silent throughout the debate. Now she spoke and everyone fell quiet. She said that Jake's logic was sound. The Empire had become too predictable through its very perfection. Their protocols and procedures were strengths against traditional enemies, but weaknesses against something that learned and adapted. If survival required change, then they would change. She gave Jake full authority to implement his plan. Jake established what he called the Irregular Fleet. Would be a new branch of the military composed primarily of humans and other species that the Valtherans had previously dismissed as inferior. Their ships would be whatever worked, not what matched regulations. Their tactics would be improvised and unpredictable. Their only rule was that there were no rules if something solved the problem. The regular military treated the irregular fleet as a joke at first. They watched human crews cobble together ships from salvage and surplus parts. They saw mixed species teams training with tactics that violated every principle of proper warfare. The admirals predicted disaster. But then the first combat reports started coming in, and the mockery turned to stunned silence. A team of human engineers disabled a collective harvester by flooding it with contradictory sensor data and false targets. A mixed crew rescued colonists by using a fake retreat that turned into an ambush when the pursuing drones committed too deeply. Another team destroyed a collective processing center by overloading its network with random noise disguised as legitimate data. The irregular fleet was winning through sheer unpredictability. Jake discovered that his bond with Ghost gave him an unexpected advantage in understanding how to fight the collective. The Vexthor's instincts combined with Jake's analytical mind created a way of thinking that was neither pure logic nor pure emotion. It was something in between, and the collective could not predict it. When Jake led missions personally, The success rate was even higher. The collective adapted its strategy. If it could not learn from the Empire's military, it would simply overwhelm them with numbers. It had assimilated enough resources to build an enormous fleet. 3 months after Jake's return from the Silent Reach, that fleet appeared at the edge of Imperial space. Thousands of ships, all connected to the hive mind, advancing in perfect coordination toward Nexus Prime itself. The Imperial fleet moved to intercept. Admiral Corvin commanded from his flagship, directing hundreds of warships in textbook defensive formations. The battle began well. The Valtheran ships were more powerful individually, and their weapons were devastating. But as the fight continued, the collective adapted. It learned from every exchange. By the 3rd hour of combat, the collective was anticipating Valtheran tactics and countering them effectively. Jake watched the battle unfold from the swift current. He could see what was happening. The regular fleet was fighting exactly as predicted. They were following their training and their doctrine perfectly, which meant they were feeding the collective exactly the information it needed. If something did not change soon, the Empire would lose. Jake opened a channel to Admiral Corvin and requested permission to engage with the irregular fleet. The Admiral initially refused. He said the irregular fleet was too small and too disorganized to make a difference. But then another squadron of Imperial ships fell to collective drones that had learned to predict their evasion patterns. The Empress, monitoring the battle from the palace, overruled Corvin. She gave Jake full tactical control of both the regular and irregular forces. It was an unprecedented move, but these were unprecedented circumstances. Jake's first order confused everyone. He told the irregular fleet to retreat in complete disarray. Ships scattered in random directions with no apparent coordination. The collective, seeing the chaos, committed more forces to pursue what looked like defeated enemies. The regular fleet, following Jake's instructions despite their confusion, broke formation and withdrew to seemingly random positions around the planet. The collective's ships advanced, trying to maintain pursuit of multiple fleeing targets. They spread out across a huge volume of space, their coordination stretched thin. That was exactly what Jake had been waiting for. He gave the second order. Every ship, regular and irregular, turned and attacked from impossible angles all at once. There was no pattern to the assault, no coordination, just dozens of independent actions happening simultaneously. The collective tried to analyze and respond, but there was nothing to analyze. One ship used ramming attacks, another deployed mines in random patterns, a third fired every weapon at maximum power with no regard for efficiency. Each action was different and unpredictable. The hive mind could not coordinate responses when there was no logical pattern to counter. The collective's formation collapsed into confusion. Jake saw his opening. He took the swift current directly into the heart of the collective fleet, with Ghost beside him on the bridge. Lisa told him he was insane, but she powered up weapons anyway. They were hunting for the central processing hub, the core intelligence that coordinated the entire hive mind. If Jake could disrupt that, the whole fleet would lose coordination. They found it buried inside a massive converted cargo vessel. The hub was a sphere of processors and data cores, pulsing with energy as it tried to make sense of the chaotic battle. Jake brought the swift current alongside and used a boarding tube to access the enemy ship. Lisa and a security team secured their entry point while Jake went deeper into the vessel with only Ghost for protection. The collective detected Jake's presence immediately. It tried to seal doors and trap him, but Jake had Ghost. The Vexthor tore through barriers like they were paper. They reached the central chamber and found themselves surrounded by the physical infrastructure of the hive mind. The collective spoke through speakers built into the walls. It said that resistance was pointless. Jake would be assimilated and his uniqueness would strengthen the collective. Jake touched the interface panel. The collective immediately tried to flood his mind with data and logical structures. It attempted to overwhelm Jake's consciousness and upload his neural patterns. But Jake's human mind, chaotic and contradictory, was unlike anything the collective had encountered. Where Valtheran minds were orderly and disciplined, Jake thought in intuitive leaps and emotional connections. His consciousness was messy and inefficient and completely unpredictable. Ghost's bond protected Jake from being completely absorbed. The Vexthor's presence created a buffer that kept Jake's mind intact while he pushed back against the collective. Instead of being assimilated, Jake infected the hive mind with pure creative chaos. He fed it random thoughts, contradictory ideas, and emotional responses that made no logical sense. The collective tried to process this information and found that it could not. Jake's way of thinking was incompatible with its structure. The central hub began to fracture. The hive mind, built on perfect logic and coordination, could not reconcile the chaos Jake had introduced. It split into thousands of subminds, each one trying to make sense of conflicting information. The unified intelligence that controlled the entire fleet shattered into confused fragments. Ships stopped moving in coordination. Some drones shut down completely while others began operating independently with no clear purpose. Jake pulled away from the interface and collapsed. Ghost dragged him back to the boarding tube while the collective ship began to tear itself apart. The subminds were giving contradictory orders to every system. Lacey got them back to the swift current seconds before the processing hub exploded. The destruction of the central intelligence sent cascading failures through the entire fleet. The Imperial forces, seeing the collective fleet lose coordination, pressed their advantage. Without the hive mind to direct them, the enemy ships were just machines following basic programming. The battle turned into a rout. By dawn, the collective fleet was destroyed or scattered. Nexus Prime was safe. The Empire had survived its greatest threat in generations. The victory celebration lasted 3 days. The Empress addressed the entire Empire and announced sweeping reforms. She issued the Nexus Accords, granting humans and other minor species equal legal status with Valtherans. Service in the military and government would be based on ability, not birth. The Empire would honor its traditions while embracing new ways of thinking. Jake's success had proven that diversity was strength, not weakness. The Empress offered Jake the position of High Chancellor to replace Vorath. It was the Esiko,